In this video, I will be going over the recovery process from substance use disorder and the incarceration setting. At the outset, it's important to define what do we mean by recovery from addiction? How does that work? Well, the basics of recovery involve rebuilding the brain's broken dopamine system. What is dopamine? Dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that helps people feel good. It's that kind of rush of chemical in your brain when you, for example, fall in love, when you have sex, when you eat an absolutely delicious meal. And it's also what is rushing into the brain when a person uses a substance. Typically, the brain ideally has a natural balancing of dopamine, although of course not everybody's brain is always working optimally, but a brain has a certain amount of dopamine. But when it gets flooded by an outside source of dopamine, and in the case of drugs, let's say the substance, the brain starts to recalibrate and downgrade how much dopamine it is putting out. In other words, it's saying, hey, I'm getting this source of dopamine from an outside place. I don't need to make as much dopamine myself. This leads to a terrible cycle where a person is desperate to feel good and get that dopamine hit, but they can't access it unless they get an outside source to deliver it, which in the case of addiction would of course be from a substance. So when somebody is trying to recover from substance addiction, what they're trying to do is find ways to rebuild that dopamine system without using the substance that they've been addicted to. Some of the ways that that could happen in a person's brain is positive relationships. So this could be restoring relationships that have gotten fraught in the midst of addiction, falling in love, or having a pet. So my clients, I know I've had one client who got a dog and a cat when she was going into recovery, and it was incredibly healing. Exercise is another way, or just any kind of physical movement. Mental health treatment, of course, meaning good types of mental health treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, and other types of psychodynamic therapy. The right kinds of medications, so if there's coexisting disorders such as depression or anxiety. Constructive activities, so working, going to school, feeling like you have something to do with your day, which can also lead into a sense of purpose, feeling that you're actually invested in your community. You'll notice that so many people who are in recovery want to give back and want to help others because it really fuels this sense of purpose in their lives. Also, accountability, feeling like you are just accountable, again, sense of purpose, these all somewhat intersect. Same with self-respect also intersects with these. And of course, growing into an adult brain, because you'll notice that many people who are struggling with addiction might be using excessively when they're young, but then they start to hit around mid-20s and are able to recalibrate in a different kind of way and move through drug use. One of the things that's really important to highlight when it comes to addiction and the intersection with the criminal legal system and incarceration is that there are many risk factors for addiction, and trauma is a fundamental risk factor. So when we talk about risk factors for addiction, we are talking about coexisting mental health disorders such as ADHD or anxiety and depression, early substance use. So there is reasons to try to keep young people away from using, although how we go about it, of course, is something to be discussed. The environment, the social risk factors, what's going on in the peer groups, what's going on in the community, of course, a genetic predisposition, and then trauma. Trauma is a fundamental aspect of addiction for most people who are struggling with substance use disorder. So one of the reasons it is important to understand the risk factors for substance use disorder is because some of these risk factors can inadvertently be existing in the incarceration setting. Unfortunately, in jails and prisons, there is a heightened risk of trauma. The other aspect of jails and prisons is that they are intended to isolate people away from society. And as a result, you're also isolating people away from support systems. And unfortunately, this can lead to worse outcomes, even if a jail or prison has the best intentions around the recovery process. As you can see in the images that are being shown here, this is a classic jail cell. A single jail cell, sometimes jail cells will have bunk beds, or a lot of times they have bunk beds, but you can see that it is basically a sterile environment that does not have a lot of daylight and access to things that can help a person basically feel comforted and self-soothed. This other image is of a dorm room. This would be in Rhode Island, DOC minimum security. Again, you can see similar, it's bare bones and not exactly a place where somebody is feeling any kind of comfort. This image is of actually Massachusetts former maximum security prison Walpole and their now maximum security prison Suze Baranowski. Again, these images are just meant to give a window into what the prison setting looks like. You can see in this one image, if somebody's in isolation, this happens to be somebody who has mental health issues and is on what's called the recreation deck. So again, this isn't what it's like for everybody, but it is what it's like for some people when they get in trouble. This is a kind of outdoor time that they're going to have. Likewise, this image, which is of San Quentin's therapeutic modules, this is for people who have serious mental illness and are doing what's called group therapy. Again, not where everybody is going, but it is an example of what some people go through when they are dealing with mental health issues. And addiction is often, or substance use disorder is very often intersecting with other mental health issues. And on a more minimum security level, of course, we see a circle that looks more similar to what you might see in terms of an AA meeting in the community. The point, however, is that when you're in the jail setting, people are essentially in isolation from the supports and the recovery processes that have been mentioned earlier. So there's not the access to the types of activities that can really lead to that elevation in dopamine that we're looking for when people are trying to recover. It can be difficult to find a sense of purpose when in jail. Now, of course, there are some people who are able to have these kinds of outcomes when they're incarcerated, but oftentimes it's very difficult for somebody who is going in, especially for in and out of jail. There's often a sense of depression in the carceral setting and a sense of hopelessness. And fundamentally, there is a sense of danger. And that is what leads to the trauma and a lack of feeling of safety. So when somebody is trying to get better and they are trying to get all of these aspects of their life together, positive relationships, having good exercise, which typically means getting outside as well, getting sunshine on the body, which is just part of being a human being and being alive, having quality mental health treatment, constructive activities, that sense of purpose, accountability, self-respect, and growing into that adult brain. Of course, you can grow into an adult brain in the carceral setting, but most of those other aspects of recovery are certainly challenging to achieve in the incarceration setting. This does not mean that jails and prisons are not, in some cases, doing their very best to do this. It's just that the very nature of how they are developed is not ideal for that rebuilding of the brain's dopamine system. This concludes our video on the recovery process from substance use disorder and the incarceration setting.